Okay, so yeah, I'm a professor over in psychology, in case a lot of you folks don't know me, although I do work with LTI every other grant, right? So, and yeah, I've worked in psycholinguistics, and so I followed Ev's work, Evelina Fedorenko, and oh my gosh, when I started to read her Vita, all the things that she's been doing. So that, I just want to give you a sense of some of them. So she's worked on ASD, autism spectrum disorder, music, polyglots, has articles about jokes, even an article about how people comprehend computer code when they don't have to use language to do that. They use other areas of the brain. A lot of this work is being done with fMRI, some of it also using ERP, and even some ECOG work. And so the very diverse topics, of course. But one of her really most fundamental contributions has to do with the separation between the language network and the multiple demand network. And of course, there's also what we call the default network. And I think it's remarkable because many of us in psycholinguistics thought that, well, language would rely a lot on executive processing. But in fact, when language is running, it seems that it uses the language network. And we use that multiple demand network for really other cognitive tasks. She's also done some really interesting work showing that you can reach some of the same conclusions based on individual subject data, rather than having to merge data all together into groups. She's done some thinking about language and thought, the place of language with other processes in the brain. So really just an incredible diversity of ideas. And I believe now she has a project working on what happens in aphasia as language becomes reorganized, what happens to those various networks that she's studied. And then most recently, I got to read her paper for the Society for the Neurobiology of Language, in which she's showing, I think, based on something like 43 different versions of neural networks, how well neural networks, these are, the deep learning neural networks, can align with what we know about language processing in the brain. And this has been done in areas like vision, where there's a lot of understanding that the early stages of visual perception can be modeled with these deep neural networks. And I think this is really the most groundbreaking work showing how these same neural networks can be used to talk about language. So she is now the Frederick and Carol Middleton Associate Professor of Neuroscience at MIT, and I'm really interested in finding out what she's going to tell us. So yeah, please take over. Thank you.
That's a very kind introduction. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me and for coming in spite of this very intense week that we're all experiencing. Hopefully I can distract you for a little bit with some science. So, all right. So I often like to start my talks by bringing forward this notion of language being kind of like a shortcut for telepathy, because we can use sequences of words to get ideas from one head to another. And no other species can do the same, at least with respect to the full spectrum of the complexity of ideas we can convey to each other. So just to get us all on the same page, because we're coming from slightly different perspectives here and from different backgrounds, what we do in language is two basic things. So what I'm doing right now is I'm converting some thoughts I have in my head into utterances. And to do this, I draw on a set of knowledge representations. This is all, by the way, I think all pretty uncontroversial framing here, just to make sure we're all aligned a little bit in terms of the scope of what we'll be talking about. And our language knowledge consists of our knowledge of the sounds of the language, of the words, and then some rules, likely probabilistic rules for how sounds can combine to form words and how words and morphemes can combine to form more complex representations like phrases and sentences. And then once I have an utterance that I want to produce, I send it down to my motor system. So in this case, I'm speaking, I'm controlling my articulators, but literate individuals can also write or type their utterances. And on your hand, you're of course doing the opposite of that. You're doing decoding. So in this case, from an auditory perceptual signal, you're extracting familiar words and constructions and then mapping them onto meanings to infer the thought that's in my head. And I would say that communicative success occurs when the active contents of our minds are somewhat similar. Unless I have other goals like deceiving you, in which case, of course, that would be different, but I'm not gonna do that. So we know now with quite some strong evidence that there are separable mechanisms in our brains and minds that support perceptual aspects of language, like speech perception or visual perception and reading. These live in our auditory and visual cortices respectively. These mechanisms are highly selective for linguistic input, but they don't seem to care about the meaningfulness of the signal. Like, for example, our speech perception mechanisms respond as strongly to a totally unfamiliar language as long as it has properties that human speech has as it does to speech in a language which you can actually understand. Similarly, on the motor output side, we have a set of mechanisms in our motor and premotor cortices that control the relevant set of effectors. Most commonly, of course, most common output of language is the spoken modality, and there's beautiful work, a lot of it from Eddie Chang's group in the last bunch of years, showing the encoding of the different articulators in their states as can be read out from the motor and premotor cortex. And the specificity of these circuits for speech control as opposed to controlling other behaviors that we can do with our mouth, like making bubbles or whatever, is debated and not quite well understood, as in contrast to the perceptual mechanisms. But both the perceptual and the motor output systems are separable from the what I call kind of higher level linguistic interpretation and production, which is this mapping between utterances and forms. And most of the work, I've done a little bit of work on speech perception and reading, but most of the work we've done has been kind of focusing on this component. So how do we infer thoughts from people's utterances? And in the next couple of minutes, I just want to sketch briefly some of the directions of the work that I've been pursuing. Most of these I won't talk about today, but we can, I just want to lay it out there so people can ask questions. We can have some discussions in the question periods if you'd like. So the kind of meat and potatoes of what we do is trying to understand how people produce and understand language. The ultimate goal is an algorithmic level of description, which has been elusive in absence of animal models and the ability to get the kind of data from humans that we can get from animals and the way to manipulate the language system in ways that has been possible to manipulate animal brains to get a better understanding of how things work. But I think we're getting somewhere, and actually the thing that Brian mentioned at the end, these artificial neural networks of language, I think may be the best tool we have to actually get somewhere towards some computational precision in language, even in absent animal models, but we'll get there towards the end of the talk. So another big line of work and a growing line of work is trying to understand how language fits within social cognition more broadly. So even though I'll show you in about 10-15 minutes that language and social cognition are separable, there is accumulating evidence from different strands of work for a very important connection between these two. And note that this is different from the kind of more traditional construals of language, where the focus has been on linking language to complex thought and focus on kind of complex structure building as the essence of language. This is a very different take on language. This is a take on language as a fundamentally communicative and social tool to form bonds with our conspecifics. And of course, this kind of ability is critical for survival early on because human infants are born very, very useless, although cute. But some recent work has started looking at processing communicative signals in macaques. And this is a picture from a recent Shepard and Freiwald paper. So this is a system that emerges when macaques view socially relevant behaviors. And when I saw this, I kind of had, chills down my spine kind of moment, because the general topography seems eerily similar to the system that we end up using for linguistic communication in humans. Now, of course, there's a big leap in terms of the kind of social information that macaques extract from their environment to what we can extract from language. Nevertheless, I think one interesting hypothesis that we're starting to explore is that we start out as a species, and perhaps ontologically as well, with a broadly social receptive system that spans extensive portions of lateral, frontal, and temporal cortex. And using that system, we process eye gaze, facial expressions, body movements, and eventually symbolic representations. And then as we get richer and richer input and more experience in the world, this kind of broad social processor fractionates into more specialized subcomponents, which process different aspects of the socially relevant signal. And of course, the evolutionary part of this is tricky to test, but I think in humans we can get somewhere trying to see if something like this maybe was how language system kind of emerged in our brains. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another big line of work, again, won't talk about this today much, is how we represent meanings. It's a big question. The dimensionality of meaning is also something that we don't even understand yet. Are there a few core dimensions? Are they interpretable? How symbolic and abstract versus embodied those are. I know some in the audience, like Brad, have strong opinions on this, so do I. I think ours are probably similar, but their debates continue about the role of embodied representations linked to sensory and motor aspects of our experience in representing meanings. And I've become a little bit warmed up to that view, given the extent of cortex from which we can decode different kinds of meanings. So I think there is work to be done to understand whether different aspects of meaning encoded in these different systems that we know are separable underlyingly. So we're trying to push a little bit on this front. We're also trying to understand how our minds and brains reorganize following damage to the language system. So here's a brain of an individual who suffered a massive left hemisphere stroke around age 65. And you can see all the atrophied tissue in white. And in this case, the damage basically encompasses the entire language system. And this individual is severely, severely impaired in both language comprehension and production. They have some residual single word comprehension, but everything else is effectively gone. So it's a case of a global aphasia. And here's a brain with a similar-ish, not quite as extensive damage, but this is a person who is missing her left temporal lobe. Now, this person didn't know that she was missing her left temporal lobe until she was 20, when she accidentally discovered this, undergoing a routine EEG testing for like a psychiatric, not psychiatric, like mood disorder condition. And the electrodes weren't picking stuff up, and she was, they changed the electrodes and they still weren't picking stuff up. And so she was sent to get a routine MRI. And it turns out she's been living without her left temporal lobe. And we've been studying her and her sister, who was born without her right temporal lobe, which is an incredible kind of, it's probably not coincidence. I would say coincidence. Of course, it probably is not coincidence. So these are cases of what's likely to be prenatal or perinatal stroke, so stroke that you get as you're going through birth canal. And these early cases of damage often go undetected, as I just mentioned, because mostly if damage happens early on in our lives, our brains are incredibly plastic and they reorganize. But there's all sorts of interesting questions you can ask in both cases of late damage and early damage. And so in case of early damage, as Marlene Berman has been doing in some domains, we can ask questions like, do we get some kind of crowding happening when suddenly the function that would be distributed in the tissue that's now damaged suddenly has to cohabit some parts of the brain with some other functions. In the cases of late damage, one question we're focusing on is, with respect to language specifically, is trying to understand why there is such variability in how well people recover. So even when you have sustained damage in adulthood, there is huge variability in how well people recover language function. And of course, some of this is due is how young you were when you got damage, how extensive the damage is, where the damage is, how much the white matter tracts are affected. But there's a lot of residual variability that still remains not perfectly understood. And I think there is interesting hypothesis about the potential contribution from domain general circuits that support kind of broad ability to flexibly reason about the world. And given the flexibility of that system to solve novel problems, it's possible that in some individuals, that system can either repurpose some part of itself to do language or provide us with alternative solution to kind of hack language in a different way than the language system does, but nevertheless lead to some communicative success. And then finally, a big and important question has to do with how people differ in how good or bad they are at language. And how the construal of what it means to be good and bad at language, of course, is very multifaceted. Some people have vast vocabularies. Some people are really good at speaking and don't make any speech errors and things like that. Some people are really good at expressing complex ideas in a way that's really precise. And so, you know, writers spend their days trying to find just the right words to express a concept or a notion. We've so far looked at one kind of linguistic expertise, which is polyglottism. So we've studied individuals who have acquired in adulthood anywhere between 10 and 50, I think, languages. And we found that their language system tends to be less extensive than in individuals who are kind of your typical monolinguals or bilinguals. Meaning that the extent of activation and the strength of the response in the language network, which I'll introduce formally in a second, is just lower and smaller, and that's reproducible within people. And it just suggests that what we think it suggests that that system doesn't need to work as hard to achieve the same level of comprehension. And there's a lot of interesting follow-ups potentially to do there, but more broadly, given the kind of rethinking of disorders as falling on a continuum as opposed to these old kind of categorical boundaries between, you know, okay, you have autism and you don't have autism, or, you know, you have a linguistic disability and you don't. We can explore the continuum of linguistic abilities and relate that variability to the neural instantiation. We now have shown that many neural markers of language responses are highly stable within people, yet variable within population, across the population. And with Simon Fisher, we're also trying to relate some of that variability to genetic variability, which of course ultimately should all connect somehow, but it's challenging. And we use a bunch of methods to look at this, as Brian said. So today I want to tell you about 3 things that we learned about the language system in the last, I guess, 10, 12 years now. So I'll show you that the brain regions that support language processing are highly specialized for that kind of input and are not needed for many forms of complex thought. That brain regions that process syntactic structure are deeply sensitive to meanings of individual words. And then finally, that I'll argue that the language architecture is fundamentally a predictive architecture. It's optimized for predicting upcoming input, as perhaps the whole brain is, but I don't need to go in. I don't have a stake in that broad question quite yet, so I'll focus on language. And here are all the folks who did most of this work. I just want to highlight Edan Blanc, who's been involved in pretty much, well, almost all of this work. He's now a faculty at UCLA, and he's looking for grad students. So if there are any graduating stars that want to go work on language, he's a fantastic mentor and a great scientist. So before I tell you about these things, I'll just spend 2 minutes telling you what I refer to when I talk about the language network. So my working definition is basically a set of left lateralized regions on the lateral surface of the frontal temporal cortex that support language processing beyond the low level auditory visual perception. So once it's gone through the speech perception or the processing of the visual input in reading, the system is the regions that handle that input. So you can find the system quickly and easily by contrasting responses to language versus some perceptually matched control condition. So you can look at the responses to sentences versus lists of non-words, or people listening to speech versus muffled speech or speech in a foreign language. The exact contrast actually doesn't matter that much, which is good, because that suggests that all of these contrasts isolate something that's shared, and I think that's basically the linguistic content that's present in the critical condition. So here are just a few sample individual subjects activations, and my group has developed robust methods to quickly find these regions in individual people. You can do it in just a few minutes of scanning, and I've argued that this is important given the variability that we've long known exists in the precise locations of these brain regions, such that if you average activations in the common space, in any given voxel, you would be pulling data from the language system and some subset of the people, but from other nearby functionally distinct areas in other people. And I just think you don't want to do that, because it adds huge amounts of noise and can lead to fundamentally flawed inferences. And this landscape, as I mentioned, is highly stable within people over time, as tested as far apart as 8 or 9 years. That's kind of the span of how long I've been doing this. You know, of course, there's going to be changes that happen as you go into the aging tail. We know that, well, at least there are claims that language activations become bilateral again as you age. But the topography within the left hemisphere regions is incredibly stable over time. And a few key things about the system is that these regions appear to be active during both comprehension and production. And it also seems to not matter. We've now done dozens of manipulations with different materials, tasks, modality of presentation in both comprehension, so reading versus listening versus sign language, and production, so writing, typing, or speaking, in line with the idea that the role in both high-level comprehension and production is in line with the idea that this is a system that stores the language knowledge representations, which of course are needed to both interpret linguistic signals and generate them in production. These regions are similar across typologically diverse languages. So we've spent some effort trying to develop tools to identify these regions in languages other than the handful of languages that have been historically studied in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science to some extent. And Brian wrote some really nice papers back with Liz Bates years and years ago, advocating for the need to look at typologically diverse languages, because some generalizations you just can't make based on weird languages like English. It's a dominant language, but it has a lot of properties that are non-typical of many of the other languages in the world. And so far, we're still at the early stages. So we've developed tools to find this system in now, I think, close to 50 languages across diverse language families. And we've shown that at least some of the basic properties, like the selectivity that I'll talk about shortly, the level of integration within the system, how strongly the regions talk to each other, like the general topography, of course, are all stable. But I think there's a lot of interesting work to do potentially to ask questions like, that I just don't think have been asked before because they couldn't have been, but asking questions like, to the extent that we have classes of languages that solve the same kind of computational problem in different ways, like for example, using word order as a cue to tell you who's doing what to whom, as opposed to morphological endings on words, where word order can be quite flexible. And again, this links very nicely with Brian's work from back in the 80s. But if those are pretty different solutions to the same problem of conveying who is doing what to whom, and it may well be the case that the system that we developed to deal with that would be somehow manifesting differently cognitively and neurally. So I'm hoping we can look at those kinds of questions at some point. And of course, these systems, these regions form a functionally integrated system. In fact, these interregional connections are so strong that you can recover this network robustly from just patterns of bold signal fluctuations. And this is just recent beautiful work from Rod Braga and Randy Buckner, where they show, so So it's just 3 sample individuals scanned on many, many, many resting state sessions. So this is just when a person is lying in the scanner and doing nothing for a few minutes. And in color, you can see the activations for the contrast that my group has been using for the last 10 years, so sentences versus non-words. And in black outlines is a system that emerges from just looking at across the brain voxel-wise patterns of fluctuation. And you find this beautiful correspondence, which I find really reassuring because once again, it tells me that the system is probably a natural kind and makes sense to study as a unit in some way.
I'd like to interrupt for a question from a
Sure.
student. I think it was on the previous slide.
Uh-huh.
Jeremiah or Han, I don't know which one of you has a question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I was wondering, you say that these regions are similar across typologically diverse languages. When you're measuring the regions, are you looking at individuals who are, say, native speakers of those languages across a population or across multiple, language populations? Or are you measuring across multiple languages in polyglot individuals?
No, these are native speakers. These are mostly monolingual. Well, they're mostly actually bilingual speakers because of people who live in the US, so they're all proficient in English, but they're all native speakers of each of those languages, yeah.
I see, okay. Thanks.
Sure. All right, and then, of course, we've also long known that at least subsets of the system are causally important for language. So again, I think the system is a natural kind in that it's robustly separable from the rest of the brain. It's stable within individuals over time. It's strongly internally integrated, and it's causally linked to linguistic ability. So now on to this first point about the system being selective for language. Okay, so, and pretty much, I think in actually all 3 of these parts, when I started working on these questions, I had a totally different prior. So like in each of those 3 cases, I got told wrong by the data, which is great. It's the joys of empirical work. So anyway, when I came into the field, this is actually the question that drew me initially to brain imaging tools, because for many questions, fMRI is really, really a very crappy tool and shouldn't be used. But for this question, it's a great tool. We can say we have these 2 mental functions. To the extent that we have tasks that can tap those functions effectively and selectively, we can ask, do they draw on the same resources or not? So it's like the tool is kind of designed to answer this question, among, of course, others, but this is a very good use of fMRI. And so I was very interested in some claims that existed. So there kind of were 2 kinds of claims about language overlapping with other things. One set of claims was along the lines of, well, language is evolutionarily late emerging. So a lot of machinery was already in place when language emerged. So maybe when language came about, it kind of co-opted bits and pieces of existing machinery from other things. Maybe some aspects of action, observation, and interpretation. That's your whole mirror neuron base kind of hypothesizing. Maybe it took some parts of executive circuits and so on and so forth. Another set of claims was actually focusing on things that also emerged late and that are human specific, like math, music, along with language, rely on complex hierarchical representations, involve operations like recursion. And so maybe there is some machinery that came about quite late, but in the end supports all of these human specific capacities, which are these kind of like high level complex things that deal with, whatever complex hierarchical stimuli or something like that. And I found that, so that there was a paper from Chomsky, Hauser, and Fitch that came out in 2002, which is just when I started grad school. And I thought the idea was really cool that humans would evolve an abstract hierarchical processor to deal with these more complex domains. But it turns out it's just totally wrong, but it was an interesting idea to test. So anyway, so we set out to evaluate these, and along with the theorizing, there were a lot of empirical claims around saying, okay, we find overlap between language machinery and non-language stuff of all sorts of things, mostly focusing on the inferior frontal cortex, but also finding it in other parts of the language system. Anyway, and I would think that, well, I would argue at this point that probably all of those empirical claims are based on flawed inferences, reasoning from anatomy to function. So many studies have done things like look at responses to some contrast of interest, find activation in Broca's area, and infer that therefore it's the same stuff that does language. That's not a reasonable inference, because the way that Broca's area, for example, is defined in the field, it's a big chunk of cortex, which has a lot of different things going on in there. So just because any two mental functions elicit responses in Broca's area doesn't mean, first of all, that they even activate the same bit of cortex, and interpreting these kinds of results is tricky. So the first thing I did when I started working in cognitive neuroscience of language was what seemed kind of the simplest and most straightforward thing, where we say, okay, now we've learned to find these language regions, language responsive regions reliably and quickly within people. Let's find, let's find Lori's language regions and Brian's language regions, and then have them do other kinds of tasks, like have them solve some math problems or listen to rich, complex music or watch other people's actions. And then we can say, do these same regions that are super active when you read or listen to sentences, are they also active when you do these other things? And so here's the response profile. This is now pulling data from across a bunch of different studies. So in black and gray, the y-axis is the bold percent signal change response. So in black and gray are responses to our localizer task, but they're estimated with data not used to define these regions. Oh, and I should say that when I show these masks are just broad constraints that we use to narrow in on the parts of the brain where most people we know show activity. So we take these broad masks, which are derived from a probabilistic activation landscape, and then within that, we take just the voxels that are reliably active in that individual person. So in any given person, their functional language ROI within this mask would be a tiny fraction of this big mask. So it's not this big chunk that we're looking at. Okay, so right, so these are responses to sentences and non-words, and in different colors are responses to people doing math problems, doing hard executive function tasks, listening to music, action, gesture, observation, social cognition. So in this case, it's a non-verbal task where people watch a naturalistic movie that varies at different points into how much you're mentalizing about other people's minds. And what you find is that all of these non-linguistic tasks cluster at 0. And again, when I started doing this, I was kind of thinking, okay, maybe I'll find specificity in the posterior temporal cortex, but then in the inferior frontal ones around Broca's area, we'll actually find some multifunctionality and some shared resources. And you just don't find this at all. You find the same damn selectivity. It's extremely non-responsive to all sorts of other things. Important to say is that all of these tasks elicit highly robust responses elsewhere in the brain. So it's not that they're bad tasks and just don't activate your brain. It just so happens that these regions that are highly active when we process language, they just don't work at all. They work as hard when you're doing math as when you're looking at a blank screen doing nothing. Okay, so this is really quite strong selectivity. One thing that's always important to mention in this context is that this specialization, of course, does not imply innateness, and I hope nobody makes that inference. In fact, we have very good cases where specialization emerges as a function of our experience in the world, like the visual word form area, which develops as we learn to read, is a good example, although there's now interesting challenges to that view as well. But the way that I think and have already mentioned thinking about this system is that it's a system that stores our linguistic knowledge as we accumulate more and more knowledge of mapping between forms and meanings. And that stuff has to be stored somewhere. This network seems like the best candidate for that. And so that construal necessarily implies that there's some developmental trajectory, so that again, maybe you start out with some early bias towards socially relevant signals, and then eventually some part of it gets carved out for storing these symbolic representations. All right, and just briefly on this point is there's a complementary set of evidence from individuals like the one I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the globally aphasic individuals with these massive left hemisphere strokes, and a colleague and friend, Rosemary Varley, who is now at UCL, has been studying this population over many years now. And it turns out that, you know, if you're clever enough to come up with a way to assess their abilities in these other domains, in some cases it's easy, like in math, you just give them a bunch of math problems to solve, right? They can do all of that just fine, suggesting at least that once you have a mature brain, you can take away the language system as what happens during like a stroke event or degeneration in some cases. And a lot of the stuff can proceed just fine. These people can drive, they can read people's social cues, they just can't talk about their thoughts using the medium that we normally talk to do that, normally use to do that. All right, so moving on to the second thing, which is maybe more controversial at this point. So two kind of core aspects of language that have long been discussed and debated across many diverse fields: linguistics, psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, philosophy. It seems, in some way, it seems almost intuitive that when we process sentences, we're doing two different things. Like on the one hand, we're kind of getting, this is just a sample sentence from a corpus, so it's a sentence that somebody actually produced. So we're getting meanings of individual words. And on the other hand, we're figuring out what role these different words play in the sentence and how they go into dependencies. And even with no linguistic training, not having taken any classes, we have good senses of what forms kind of good chunks of meaning and what doesn't. Like, N picked up his car keys is like a good chunk, but on his sports coat and is just not a good chunk. So we have a good sense of how these words group together into meaningful phrases and sentences. And the leading proposals, many leading proposals of the neural architecture of language, continue to postulate a distinct syntax or combinatoric selective component, meaning some part of the language system that just does combinatorics and doesn't care about word meanings. So again, this idea of kind of a more abstract structural processor is still very prominent. But this divide between syntax and word meanings has long been questioned. From the 90s, at least, where there's a lot of active debates about it. So for example, on the side of linguistic theorizing, people very quickly observed that you're not gonna get far using abstract categories like nouns and verbs, like a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. To capture anything like the richness of the language knowledge we have, you need reference to particular words. And of course, your textbook example is the knowledge of verbs, where shiver, comfort, and put are all verbs, but they have very different kinds of restrictions on how they can combine. So it's word-specific combinatorial constraints. And in terms of experimental work and some corpus work, people found that we're exquisitely sensitive to contingencies between words and the structures that they occur in, suggesting that those two sorts of knowledge are just not cleanly separated, most likely. And again, some of Liz Bates's early work has shown that lexical abilities, so how we know and use words, is very strongly correlated and predictive of people's grammatical abilities, both developmentally and in adulthood. So linguistic mechanisms that were initially early on proposed kind of by, in traditional Chomskyan views to be highly distinct, instead seem to be actually quite tightly integrated. And so in line with a strong integration, I'm going to question the existence of brain regions that support syntactic processing and not the processing of word meanings. And there's two components to this. So one, I'll show you that combinatorial processing is distributed across the language network. So it's not focally present in just one region or a couple of regions or something like that. And then I'll show you actually that anything that cares about syntax also cares about word meanings. So a number of proposals have been put forward about a syntactic hub. That's become a very common collocation. I really dislike that term. But anyway, the most common notion is perhaps that, there is a hub in Broca's area. It's kind of one of the oldest claims out there. But there's also a lot of people who actually have been recently even arguing that the core hub is actually in the posterior temporal cortex. But then there's others who say that it's actually in the anterior temporal cortex. And then there's some others who say that maybe there's like two hubs and they talk to each other. Anyway, so the lack of consensus that is, kind of very apparent across the field should already raise flags that maybe if different people find it in different places, maybe it's not actually folklore represented. But anyway, so the kind of evidence that people have used to argue for focal representation and processing of syntax has often been based on manipulations of syntactic complexity. So looking at sentences with local versus longer distance dependencies. So this is a standard example of subject and object extractive relative clauses. So senator, attacker, reporter, all the connections are local. as opposed to an object relative where the senator has to be linked to a tact and there is an intervening element. And behaviorally, we know that there's a cost associated with this, it's easily measurable. And if you do a whole brain contrast on these harder versus easier sentences, you often get this blob in the inferior frontal cortex and actually in the posterior temporal cortex, which is here very interestingly obscured by an inset in this figure, so you can't see it, but there is a posterior temporal bit. But in any case, it seems like maybe pretty focal. There's a couple of things. But the problem is that just because something doesn't emerge in a whole brain group analysis in fMRI does not mean that other regions are not doing this. It's just your general fallacy of drawing wrong inferences without doing proper interaction analyses. And so indeed, if you define language responsive areas in each person and then say, okay, do these regions, are they sensitive to this syntactic complexity manipulation? You replicate very well the sensitivity in the inferior frontal cortex, but you also find it robustly in the posterior temporal cortex and the anterior temporal cortex and the inferior part. So basically every language region you look at, you find this reliably stronger response to harder syntax. And I should say that, so it seems like it's distributed across. And I should say that studies of patients with brain damage, although they remain studies that argue for focal and hub-like representations, I would say taking the literature as a whole, and maybe Brian can comment on this in the question period, but I think taking literature as a whole, I would say that there is a failure to consistently link syntactic comprehension deficits to a particular locus within the language network. And in fact, if you take regular non-brain damaged individuals and put them under duress or under difficult processing conditions, you'll find the very same kinds of deficits that you observe in individuals with damaged different parts of the language network. And so many researchers in the aphasia domain now argue that the language system supports the syntactic process as a whole with quite some redundancy across it. Okay, I'm going to try to breeze through this one. So this is this other part about sensitivity to both syntax and word meanings. So, okay, so I just told you that syntax kind of happens everywhere. You can find sensitivity to syntactic manipulations everywhere, but maybe there are some parts of that system that actually just do syntax and don't much respond to lexical things like meanings of words. And to ask that kind of question, you want to look at some paradigm that directly compares syntactic structure and word meanings. And a very standard way to do this that many groups have used over the years is this kind of simple 2x2 crossing of the presence of word meanings and the presence of structure. So sentences is again a sample sentence from a corpus, has both word meanings that are interpretable and it's a structured stimulus. You can take a list of words that are all interpretable but don't go together. Or you can take what's called a Jabberwocky sentence following Lewis Carroll, where all real words are replaced with non-words. So this just sounds like jargon. Sometimes you go to talks and the input sounds like this. I hope you don't have this experience today, but when people use a lot of jargon, that's effectively what it sounds like. It sounds like real sentences, but it doesn't just all make sense to you with respect to your world knowledge. And then you can scramble those and get a list of non-words. And again, I had a strong prior coming into this. This is like back in 2008, I guess 2009, that we would find some regions that care a lot about word meanings, so respond strongly whenever there are real interpretable meanings in the input. And other regions that care about structure, so they would respond strongly whenever the input is structured in some way. So even though we can't interpret Jabberwocky sentences, we get a sense that there's dependencies among words and we can kind of figure out the coarse structural representation. And this profile, these profiles just don't exist anywhere. Well, actually, this profile exists to some extent in some places. This profile just doesn't exist anywhere. Instead, what you find throughout the language network, including looking not even averaging across clusters of voxels within these regions, but looking at individual voxel level responses, you find this very clear two main effects pattern where the response is strongest to sentences, lower to the conditions that either have word meanings or structure, and lowest to non-words. And you find this in fMRI and ECOG, so I'm just trying to speed through so I can get through some exciting stuff at the end. In fact, in ECOG, you very reliably find, so this is across electrodes, and the reason that there's this big difference between the two intermediate conditions is there's quite a lot of electrodes that show much stronger responses to unconnected lists of words than to Jabberwocky sentences. And there's no electrode that shows any hint of kind of an overall preference for structured stimuli. So anything that shows some effect of structure, as evidenced by stronger sentences than word list effect and Jabberwocky than non-word list effects, also show very strong effects of lexicality. So stronger responses to interpretable stimuli compared to uninterpretable ones. Okay, and there's other paradigms we've looked at. We've pretty much looked at every paradigm that has been used to argue for this, and you just find sensitivity to both word meaning manipulations and structural manipulations. And the fact that I've alluded to this, so the fact that word meanings can be decoded from across the language network, both frontal and temporal regions, as well as other parts of the brain, once again kind of highlights the idea that it can be the case that some parts of this network are selective for syntax, because it seems like they all carry some information about word meanings as can be decoded using these distributional semantic models, including beautiful work that Leila has been doing at CMU, you guys. Okay, so it appears that any region that shows sensitivity to syntactic structure is at least as sensitive to meanings of individual words, and often there's actually a bias towards individual word meaning processing. And this aligns with linguistic theorizing and behavioral evidence, but runs contrary to many proposals of the neural architecture of language that keep arguing that there is this some part of the network, wherever it may be, that just does combinatorics and doesn't care about word meanings. Okay, we're currently trying to take advantage of cutting edge methodological approaches so that maybe this will help bring more closure to this question. So we're trying to look at things like laminar imaging and single cell recordings intraoperatively to see if there's any hints of evidence of sensitivity to abstract structure in language. At this point, I really don't think it's likely at all, but I'm always happy to be surprised by data. So we'll know more in a couple of years, but yeah, and I summarized a lot of this work in a recent paper that just came out in Cognition. Okay, before I move on, I want to make two things briefly, see if I can do that. Let me actually just skip a couple things. So I want to also tell you that, I mean, highly relevant to this general question of the relationship between structure and word meanings, we're also finding that the temporal integration window of the language network. So this is a notion that's gaining a lot of ground in cognitive neuroscience across domains. So it's basically how long back the preceding context affects the processing of the current input, right? Over which span of information are you doing your computations? It seems like the temporal integration window of the language system is quite short. It's in the order of 6 words. Words is probably not the right units. It's got to be something like bits. In fact, word is a very English-centric notion to start with. But anyway, to operationalize it and to make it easier to talk about, we'll talk about words. And the way that you find this is you take, and this a lot of these methods were developed from by Uri Hasson at Princeton. The way you can do this is you take a full-blown, I don't know, story or something like that, and then you chop it up at different granularities. So to chop it up into individual words and rearrange them, or into sequences of 2 words and rearrange those, or sequences of 3 words, and so on and so forth. And of course, as I already mentioned to you just a few slides ago, you find a big difference between the processing of an unconnected list of words and a sentence. So there's a big effect there. Sentences definitely give you a much stronger response. But if you look at responses to sequences of 2-word chunks and 3-word chunks, you get a gradual increase in the response in the language regions. But the response seems to asymptote around 6 sizes of chunk size 6. And it may seem striking initially because of course we can form long distance dependencies that span much longer periods. But if we take to heart the idea that our language system is adapted to our environment and to the kind of input we get. And we look at what's been found about dependencies in natural language, it's actually the case that most dependencies in natural language are local. And so maybe given that, it's not that surprising that the system would be attuned to combinatorics within very local scales. And another recent finding, which I'm not gonna have time to talk about, is it actually turns out that within these local chunks, you have quite a lot of tolerance to word order scrambling. Perhaps not unlike these effects that you guys may have seen in popular press, where you take a word and you scramble letters around and you can still recognize it, provided enough context especially. On a local scale, if you move words around within the sentence, you get as strong a response to those stimuli as to well-formed, meaningful chunks, which you typically see, which to me suggests that whatever computations the language system carries out is not affected by word order, which I suspect.
Oh, and interrupt, there are 2 questions in the chat.
Okay, sure.
Brian, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Oh, and I want to point out that we have, that this colloquium officially lasts until 2:50, so we have a half hour, and it's okay if we have some discussion now. And
Sure, great. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about these ANN stuff, but yeah, I'm.
Okay, so we'll take 2
sounds like I'll
questions.
get there.
Yeah, we'll take 2 questions and then let you go on. And then more
Perfect.
questions.
Perfect.
Okay. So Brian, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. No, actually, I had other questions, but this was the one I posted. I wonder, I mean, I really think it's beautiful that you're finding all these areas responding to complexity. Liz Bates would have loved this, by the way.
That's so nice. I
Okay,
would have loved to meet her.
Yeah. But I wonder if that might not be reflecting the possibility that these different areas are, what I would call skinning, several ways of skinning the cat. Some are looking for maybe a more phrasal structure, slot filling from a construction. Some might be looking at the sort of the affordances of the word. And that those would run in parallel and then would come together to sort of solve the problem in a
different aspect of the problem.
combined way.
Yeah.
So that would not, yes, language would be all across this area, but there still could be some differential processing skill in the different areas.
I am totally friendly and amenable to that possibility. I do think that to the extent that you want to propose something like that, there have to be some empirical predictions that should be tested.
Yeah, I
right?
figured you'd say that, yeah.
Yeah. And so far, the kinds of proposals, so that's exactly right. I think part of the reason of why we may not be finding separability among the different language regions is exactly because the kinds of cuts that had been proposed are just not the right cuts.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if we reconsider how exactly this divides up, I mean, so in fact, one proposal that I would have never considered, given again my early training in syntax-centric accounts, is maybe there's different kinds of meanings that are more robustly present in different. So again, this is not to do with which aspect of the signal you're processing, but more with the kinds of meanings you're constructing. But if you think there are well-articulated proposals for distinctions, like the ones you mentioned, like, construction frames versus, I don't know, some other things.
Yeah, no, that you could work at these out, but that's what,
Yeah,
but
that would be great.
Your data challenge that point of view and coming up with good predictions, yeah.
Yeah, that would be great.
That's
I would
good.
love to. I love dissociations. I come from a splitting, not a merging kind of training. And so I started out by looking for these dissociations and I just haven't found them so far.
This is both splitting and merging, yeah.
Yeah, in some way, that's right. That's true, I guess, both. Somebody else had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, Vlad, would you like to unmute and ask?
Sure, I think this is related to the previous question. I guess I was wondering how much, given the fact that there's a lot of meaning in syntax, whether a word is a noun or a verb, how much that kind of confounds this idea of separation to begin with. And so is it the fact that, you're trying to split, would it be a better use, would it be more informative if we were splitting, meaning from whether it's a noun and verb first, and then trying to get at syntax? Those seem pretty confounded with each other. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand what you concretely propose, but we've certainly also tried to look at selectivity to parts of speech, like at the word level, which again, but that, you know, even at that level, there's of course meaning and structure go hand in hand, right? Nouns capture different kinds of meanings than verbs and other things. And I think actually this paper I cited from Leila's group, Reddy and Webby, I think they show that in terms of multivariate decoding, the very same regions that decode part of speech kind of information and some syntactic parse related information are also the very same ones that carry information about word identity. But I'm happy to talk more offline. I mean, it sounds like maybe I didn't quite get your suggestion of what to do, but maybe we can circle back to that or follow up, whatever you.
Oh, no, I guess my question is more so it seems like syntax and semantics are a little confounded given that syntax has a lot of semantics simply by how the word is placed in the sentence, right? Even if it's a nonsense word, we can still know what kind of word it is.
That's absolutely right. It's just a very different construal of syntax than the one that's advocated by many others, where it's all like syntax is the king. You can't do semantic composition until you have syntactically configured the right structure. And I think that's, given, you know, some of what I've talked about, but also many, many strands of related evidence, that's just not the right way to think about language. I think to the extent that syntax exists, it exists in the service of getting meaning out. And actually why we have syntax is a deeply, deeply interesting and important question. And I think one common assumption that we have it to talk about things that we otherwise would not be able to express in clear and unambiguous ways. And that's not at all clear to me that that's true. So for example, you know, millions of NIH dollars, probably billions, have been spent on studying sentences like the cat was chased by the dog chased the cat. But, you know, you have to know who is doing what to whom to parse, like you have to know the parse to understand who is doing what to whom. Now, if you take a large corpus of English and you pull out transitive sentences that contain transitive verbs, and you extract the noun phrases from those, and then you just give a bunch of people these three triplets, right, of the verb and the noun phrases, and you can strip away all the cues like case cues or whatever markings may exist. And just based on the lexical semantics, in 90 to 95% of the cases, people can perfectly tell you who is doing what to whom, suggesting that minimally a lot of syntactic information is highly redundant with lexical semantics. And Steve Piantadosi and Frank Mollica have a beautiful paper trying to do kind of back of the envelope calculations of how much space you need to store our knowledge of language. I highly recommend this paper. I think it should be kind of an obligatory reading for everybody starting to students in language classes. And it turns out that most of the knowledge we store is meanings of words. And to store syntax, you actually need very, very few bits. And I think that's in line again with the whole information theoretic framework of which bits in the signal carry the information. And I think syntax just carries a lot less than some of the early construals have tried to attribute to it.
What was that reference?
It's Mollica and Piantadosi. It's like a Royal Society, one of those B proceedings, you know, I never put the name of the journal, but I'll send you a link after the thing. But anyway, and so why we have syntax, I think, is still a very big question that, you know, I can construe, like, you know, certainly it makes comprehension faster. If you add some consistency as to how you order elements and add some markers that help you form dependence, of course, you're going to be faster. It may be because it speeds up production. Production is a super hard problem. We choose from among, you know, tens of thousands of words at our disposal, and we have to order them just the right way. Maybe constraints of how exactly we can do that is a big pressure that has led to this regularization, which is effectively what syntax is, regularizing these patterns. But anyway, okay, so let me maybe get through the third thing, which is much shorter, just a few minutes, and then maybe we can talk about these and other things again some more. All right, so prediction. Okay, so first of all, of course, behaviorally, there's been accumulating evidence from the last many years showing evidence of people engaging in predictive processing as opposed to being these kind of passive receivers of linguistic information. And so, inspired by kind of this accumulating evidence, Corey Shane, who is an incoming postdoc, wanted to look at this in our brain data. So we took story. So it took a naturalistic comprehension approach, because another shift that's kind of been happening in the cogneuro side of language, I guess behaviorally as well a little bit, is a move towards more naturalistic paradigms, because so many paradigms that rely on artificially constructed stimuli and have some artificial task on top appear to be tapping at least some resources that are not engaged when we process language kind of naturally for meaning. Anyway, so in this case, we took some naturalistic story materials. People listened to them while lying in the scanner. And we coded them for two kinds of surprisal. So two very common ways to think of surprisal. So you can code, surprisal is just a formal measure. It's a negative log probability based on the preceding context. And you can compute this either on an exact sequence of words, so n-grams. So this is based on 5 grams. We have a lexicalized measure. And then we have a syntactic surprisal measure, which is based on sequences of parts of speech using a standard probabilistic context-free grammar parser. And so this is now responses on average to words. And in blue is lexicalized 5-gram surprisal, and in red is syntactic surprisal. This is across the regions of the language network, but you find the same exact pattern in every region. And these effects explain a big chunk of explainable variance. That's like, you know, in fMRI, you often read papers and you find effects that are reliable, but that explain like, you know, 1/3% of variance. And now we're all very attuned to 1/3% because that can make our country normal again, potentially. But in science, generally, if you have an effect that explains some teeny tiny fraction of variance, like how much do you want to care about that? Like, again, you know, I was trained and have this propensity to go for big effects, and so I'm happy when we see effects that actually explain substantial amounts of variance. Anyway, so that's just like a little precursor here. So the key, and of course, the fact that you find sensitivity to both n-Grammy and PCFG surprisal, and they're independent effects, I should say. So if you put them on the same model, they each explain independent chunks of the variance. The fact that you find both of those across the system is again reiterating that point about the non-separability of abstract syntax from word meanings. But for the purposes of this last part, let's just focus on the fact, okay, there seem to be robust sensitivity to surprisal in these language regions. And you don't find it in other systems, by the way, so it's not like a ubiquitous effect across the brain. But now on to this work that I'm perhaps most excited about these days. And in spite of many years of trying to understand how language processing works in the brain, it's been challenging to go beyond descriptive models. And people throw around terms like mechanisms, and it's sometimes really frustrating because it's not really mechanisms. Like what we really want to do, it's, you know, who was the guy who said, if you can't build it, you don't understand it? One of them. Famous people. Anyway, I was stuck because I was like, I don't want to make quote unquote models of language where I put little labels on bits of the brain like syntax or lexical semantics. Like it's just not satisfactory, right? We really want to understand what is going on under the hood. And I was just really kind of stuck and going through some existential crises, like not knowing how to get beyond this level of, okay, sure, the stuff we've done constrains hypothesis space substantially. Like I basically showed, look, you don't have language relying on abstract hierarchical structure parsers. Otherwise, they would overlap with other domains and show kind of word independent properties. So that's already like, you know, and then there's other aspects of our work that narrow things in other ways, but it's frustrating. And then suddenly, and of course, the reason that I felt stuck and that many others in the field, I think, have been stuck is that we haven't had an adequate computation explicit account of how meaning could be extracted from language, because no algorithms existed until very recently that could perform this test on kind of the full spectrum of inputs, like give it a linguistic input and it can do useful things with it. But this recent class of artificial neural network models of language trained on generic word prediction tasks, like fill in the missing word or get the next word, suddenly appear to form representations that approximate meaning well enough to be able to answer questions, to generate free-form text prompts, text from prompts, translate between languages, and generally just achieve the kind of performance on benchmark and LP tests that I did not foresee at all based on like my early learning of connectionism in the 90s in grad school or 2000s or whatever. And the success of such models could be taken to suggest that a system that's optimized for predictive language processing may form this very general useful representation of sentence meaning, which is perhaps what we also need as biological systems dealing with linguistic input. And of course, in parallel, a revolution has taken place in vision research where suddenly these convolutional deep neural nets, which achieve remarkable performance on object recognition, were related to ventral visual stream responses in both animals and humans, and have been shown to provide a remarkable fit, even kind of layer by layer to different parts of the visual stream as you unfold the stimulus from the very, very low level features to all the way to objects. And inspired by this general approach, this very smart and ambitious student in Jim DiCarlo's lab, who is a vision person, wanted to take a step doing this in language. And I was certain that this wouldn't work, but you know, it sounded like a fun enterprise. And so along with another crew of former and current students, and with Nancy Kamwisher and Josh Tenenbaum, kind of took a step at this. So the paper is now on bioRxiv, so everybody's welcome to read this. It's under review. But the thing I want to highlight here, which is kind of the essence of this general approach, is that in order to robustly, so ideally we want to link computation, so kind of the actual implemented things that are going on in these models and in our brains, neural responses and behavior. And to link all three of these, I just think it's never going to be enough to test a single model on a single data set or a single kind of data. And the approach that kind of emerged in doing this kind of work in vision, relating models to brains, is what's sometimes referred to as large-scale integrative benchmarking. And the term sounds a little bit like a mouthful, but it actually has good, you can unpack good semantics of it. So Martin Schrimpf, the lead author on this paper, just had a neuron like opinion piece laying out that kind of general approach, mostly with a focus on vision. But the idea here is that you take a slew of models, and then what you're looking for is consistent patterns of performance across many different kinds of models, along with examining their performance in some proposed core computation for the system of interest. So in vision, it's object recognition, and language, it's maybe something like successfully predicting upcoming linguistic input. And given the complexities of brain structure and the functions it performs, any one of these models is almost certainly oversimplified and wrong, but some models can be less wrong. And if you see consistent trends in performance across many models, maybe you actually get some insights that go well beyond what any particular single model can tell you. Anyway, so what we did was take 43 state-of-the-art language models and compared them against 3 human neural data set. The general setup is you present the same stimulus to the brain and to the model. You get some internal representations from the model or neural responses, and then you basically compare how similar they are. And I'll tell you a little more in a second. Yeah, and I already said that. So it's not just say, okay, is this model good or bad? It's look at a continuum of scores of models and try to see what it is about the models that do better in predicting brain data that makes them a better fit to the brain. And we looked at basically 3 kind of broad classes of models, so embedding models, recurrent networks, and transformers. The largest class of models we included, which are the models that have been really causing a stir, including making it into the New Yorker and the New York Times, and doing all these cool things with language. Oh, by the way, you guys, many of you may have seen criticism of these models. Like Gary Marcus has been a very vocal critic of these models, but it's all really misguided, I think, because what they criticize these models for is not being able to think. These models are not trained to think. These models are trained to do language. And as some of our work very clearly shows, there is very strong separation between language and thinking. You can take language away and you can still think. You can think proverbally. Animals can do, at least some forms of complex thought. So just because this model that can't do math or can't make a complex inference on the representation that it extracted from linguistic input doesn't make them bad models of language. It makes them bad models of thought. But anyway, and then we had 3 data sets. They're not huge. One is fMRI, two are fMRI, and one is a small ECOG data set. And we're currently expanding this set substantially up to dozens of neural benchmarks. But kind of more concretely what we do, I mean, again, it's very simple. The approach is very simple. You basically divide your stimuli into 5 parts, and then you use 80% to train a regression between model activations and brain recordings. And then you test the model predictions on the held out 20% of stimuli against the held out human data for the left out stimuli, and you do five-fold cross-validation across all the possible splits. And then you basically get a similarity score, average similarity score for each model and brain pair. And we asked a few different things. So first we just asked, okay, do any of these models come close to capturing human neural responses? And this is just one brain data set. So this is normalized predictivity. So raw predictivity in this model. So this is basically how internally, so the way that we estimate ceiling, what is here at 1, is how well you can predict any individual's neural data from the average of the other people's neural data. And that's one way to compute ceiling. There's others, and we're actually exploring that in some ways, but it's a very reasonable thing, I think, that a lot of groups use as to estimate a ceiling. Anyway, and the embedding models do really pretty poorly. Recurrent models do maybe a little better. And then once you get to transformers, the latest transformers, the unidirectional attention transformers like GPT class of models, basically hit ceiling already for this data set. And models vary a lot, which I think is a very good property, because then we can explore what makes models better or worse at explaining brain data. It's similar for an ECOG data set. It's quite a bit worse, although the pattern of which models do best is similar for another brain data set. This is a data set with more extended stories. We think that may be partially why these models are not capturing it as well, but we're looking more into this right now. But at least on 2 data sets, ECOG and fMRI, you basically get to ceiling with GPT-2-like models. And then what I found at the time most exciting and most promising is that the models that do best on next word prediction tasks are the very same ones that do best on brain scores. There's a very strong relationship between how well a model does on next word prediction and how well it fits the human brain. And you find this across data sets, although not reliably for the small ECOG data set, but it's a consistent pattern. And importantly, if you take a bunch of other NLP tasks, maybe like you're better at any language tasks, and then you provide a better fit to neural data, that's not right at all. So we use the GLUE benchmarks, which is a bunch of kind of sophisticated-ish language tasks, and performance on those tasks varies across models, but it's not at all related to the fit to the brain. So something is special about this next word prediction task. And that's where I think that maybe optimizing for predictive representations is a critical objective for both biological and biological and artificial neural network models of language. And then we also showed that it links nicely to behavior. So the models that explain behavioral performance also are the ones that explain brain data better. And I'm gonna skip this last bit and just summarize here. So given that some of these models capture human neural processing, language processing quite well, they provide tentative mechanistic level hypotheses for how human language comprehension could proceed. But there is a lot of work. This is really just the first step as opposed to any kind of final stage of anything. So I'm trying to hide something here. Okay. So going forward, we're trying to push on a few different fronts. So those of you who work in vision or intersect with vision, you may know that there's now a platform called BrainScore, which was developed in Jim DiCarlo's lab. And the ultimate goal is for that platform to be used across the field broadly. And there's a way to add neural and behavioral benchmarks, and there's a way to add models. And so the infrastructure that's in place is basically for any new added model or data set, it will add it to this correlation plot of models on the average of all neural data sets. And so people who develop models can kind of see this as a competition to improve their models to best predict the wide range of behavioral neural data. And people who study brains can see it as to try to understand, to the extent that suddenly a model does much, much better on explaining neural data, what is it about that model? Is it just that it got bigger, or is there some architectural priors built in that may provide it, make it a much better fit to human brain data. So we're building a similar platform for language called BrainScore/language. And we're, like I said, we're expanding a lot on the benchmarks to try to get at least to 30, 40 kind of core benchmarks, and we'll solicit those from the field more broadly soon-ish. The key thing, of course, is then to dissect high-performing models to try to understand the necessary and sufficient conditions for human-like language processing. Ideally, this would lead to intuitive theories around their inner workings, although there's also interesting debates that have been going on between Bouchaki and David Popel about how critical is it for us as scientists to verbalize what's going on under the hood. Maybe we just don't have the vocabulary yet to have like an intuitive level verbal description of the underlying computations. And I think there's kind of interesting philosophy of science there to think about, but I still kind of like, I like to have intuitive explanations because of course it's easier to think about things this way. And then, you know, ultimately it would be really nice to actually integrate these language models which don't do thinking and which don't do reasoning, just like the human language system doesn't, with models of our knowledge of the world. So those presumably would have to use some symbolic or at least some sub-symbolic representations. And there's some work that Josh Tannenbaum's group is pushing on this front to develop models, at least for toy kind of aspects of the world so far, but hopefully will be scaled up. And I know other groups are working on this as well. So eventually it would be really nice to link the robust system for mapping forms to meanings with an actual system that then can take as input those extracted meaning representations and perform downstream reasoning tasks on them, which is what a lot of complex thought is about. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. So basically the takeaways are brain regions that do language don't do other stuff. But it's, I don't know, I don't have a horse in that race. I would say it's unlikely that there's any innate stuff there. I think it's just a plausible place to store for meaning mappings as we learn them, as we're exposed to language. There is no strong separation or any, as far as we can tell right now, between the processing of the structure and the lexical meanings. And from both just empirical work looking at neural responses to language and perhaps this recent work which shows that models that best perform on next word prediction are also the best at capturing something about human neural data, to me at least suggests that maybe both of these kinds of models, the brain and these models, are optimized for predicting upcoming input. And so with this, I'm going to end. I'm so sorry for running over, but thanks so much for listening and giving me a chance to share this stuff.
Thank you so much for that talk. I'll clap for everybody. Some other people are clapping in the